Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Weirdly Wired Women podcast. This is our first book club episode. This kind of came about because I have a bunch of business books and self-help books and all of these kinds of books, and I would read them before I knew I had ADHD, and I wouldn't be able to do all of the things, and then I felt terrible. But I kept buying the books and then just not reading the books. So I have quite a lot of books. And then when I realized I had ADHD, I realized why some of these, or some of the things that are in these books that seem like they would work aren't going to work for me, because the science and the audience is a general neurotypical person. So I wanted to start looking at these books again through that lens, with some guests. And so this is our first episode. We're doing Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones, by James Clear. So many people have recommended this book to me. And so this is our first book. My guest is a friend of mine, Erin Kehrier. She's a licensed clinical social worker in Texas and Michigan, and practices as a psychotherapist. She's also late diagnosed ADHD. So I believe she said you read this book before your diagnosis and then after, or no?
No,
Okay.
and yeah, unfortunately, no. I was hoping that would be the case, but yeah, in this case, I read it afterwards. But yeah, definitely feel like that changed the perspective that I was reading this kind of content from. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I went through it and I was writing notes about it today. And it's funny because as I was reading it, I was flagging a lot of pages, and I feel like I was like, oh, well, this is terrible. And this is like, I was kind of having some negative perceptions about it. But then when I went back through the things I had flagged and was writing my notes, I actually did like it.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff in there much better than I thought that I had originally done. There were some things more towards the end, and maybe that's why they're sticking with me a little more, is because they were closer to the end. But the premise of Atomic Habits is that tiny little habits and tiny changes have big impact, and so you don't have to do this ginormous thing. And I think that for anybody, but particularly ADHD, is really just something to think about, because I know we get so excited and we're like, we're going to do it all today. Yeah. And then when it doesn't happen, we're like, we suck.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and especially on like the really hard days where just like getting out of bed or getting off the couch can feel like such an enormous task, can be kind of reassuring, I think, to know that like, oh, I just have to make it smaller. Maybe the first thing I do is swing my legs over the side of the bed or whatever it is.
Exactly.
And that's the small thing you did.
Right. So, so I really liked that, just that whole idea. And and the idea also of stacking your habits. So if you're trying to build something, doing it on something that you already do. But like, I was also thinking about what I do habitually that I could add something to. And my days are so inconsistent. Like, I think the only thing I do automatically is take my contacts out and put them in the mornings and brush my teeth. Because that's it. Because while I would love to like do my face care regimen every day, I don't. Like, even though it comes right after those things, it's not always something that's going to happen.
Exactly. Not a guarantee. Yeah. I think he even spoke to that too. Like the habit stacking, will only work if you're pairing it with something that happens at the same frequency as the new thing that you want to do. So yeah, if that's not the case, it's gonna
mine theoretically should be like, I'm like, yeah, I should clean my face every day. But sometimes it's just like splashing water, and then sometimes it's the whole,
Right. But I think that's such an easy trap, even like for anyone, but for ADHDers to get into too, is like, oh, I should be able to be doing these things consistently. But like, that's just such a big part of ADHD, is being consistent is not a simple thing for a lot of us.
Right. And that's where when I was reading this, I was thinking about that from the, because one of the things to create a habit is consistency. And the idea that, and this is the part that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and maybe it was just the wording, but it was something like, was kind of judgy, like winners do this and losers do this. And
Oh, yeah. I did
the
not like the labeling stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
the loser part was like they don't rebound quickly when you fail. And we're already so like
Yeah.
one of the things that doesn't actually work for me, which it may work for other people, but it does not work for me, is tracking and
Mm.
seeing that streak, because they're like, because you don't want to break the streak. Well, but when I break the streak, then I'm like, I broke the streak, and I just like I cannot rebound that
It's
quickly.
over. Yeah.
Right, that
Like,
sends me into the
yeah.
spiral, and
Uh-huh.
because of the way my brain works. And so it's
Yeah.
not the lack of willpower to get back on and start the streak over again. It's like it's so yes, for me, tracking is a surefire way to fail, because eventually I'm going to break the streak. The other thing is like I I tried to do meal tracking once, and oh my God,
Mm.
that's so tedious.
It is. Oh, it's so boring sometimes,
It's so
right?
boring. And then like yeah, because I was doing it for this through one of those app things, and it was like this study, and they're like, you can, they had a lot of stuff in there, but if you made something from scratch, you're like, I don't know, like a cup of tomatoes, I don't know how much was in there, so you're having to figure all of this out and put all of these ingredients in. And
Mm.
so then I was like, I'm just going to go get some prepackaged something that's got the calories right on it. And like, so first of all, this is not effective because I'm choosing the worst option, because this one is a pain in the ass. And yeah, and then I just got so bored with it. I'm like, I'm not tracking my food.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, all of that. I think it's going to take a lot of steps or like a lot of planning or organizing or remembering. Like those are all executive functioning things that ADHDers have a lot of difficulty with. So, yeah, like if it's gonna be tedious, so tedious that you don't keep up with it,
Mhm.
it's probably not going to be a terribly effective strategy. And yeah, if it gets boring, like I think that was one of the other things too, somewhere in there, they were talking about like, you need to, uh, I don't know how he said it, appreciate the boredom or like make peace with the boredom or something like that. When it comes to the repetition required
Mhm.
and like needing to practice something over and over again, even when it's boring, I was like, that's nice, but I feel like you didn't give us a strategy to work through that. It was kind of just like, this is something you need. And I was like, a lot of ADHDers don't have that. So what's going to work for us? How to
Yeah,
work through the boredom phase.
yeah. At some point, he does mention like self-control about these things, and I'm like, but that assumes that you have the control. And like he even cites the study, which I thought was interesting and I'd heard before, but like when they blocked dopamine in rats, the rats just kind of like lost their will to live. And that's exactly the kind of like we just are constantly struggling for dopamine because our brain processes it so fast. So if the dopamine is there, it's not even like we're looking for it. We're just like nothing's going to happen. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think there are assumptions in here that um, that don't necessarily work if you're struggling with that. And although he does go in and to say that dopamine isn't the only thing
Yeah.
involved in habit formation, but it is the
Right.
biggest like reward thing. And if you're supposed to be rewarding yourself and you can't, like, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Exactly.
I think a lot of these things might be useful, but also double-edged swords when you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that I tried to walk into it with is just like, uh, maybe this is helpful advice sometimes, right?
Mhm.
Like, where are the applications? And maybe it's something that you try. And then if it doesn't work, like, how can we have some recognition of maybe why it didn't work? And even just like some compassion for ourselves that like it's okay if
Right.
these things don't work for us or if they only work for a little while or if we can use them half of the days but not all of the days like is that still useful, is that still helpful? And I think in many cases it is, especially if we can sort of redefine what success looks like for us
Mhm.
and have that compassion for ourselves when it doesn't look exactly like we think it's supposed to based on a neurotypical model.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think, there are a lot of things that we struggle with, that everybody struggles with, and we just struggle with them more. Like, one of the hard things about habits is that it often requires delayed gratification, which
Yeah.
stinks anyway, but especially when you think in the terms of now and like never, basically. So
Right.
I think just being aware of those things, and that those struggles are not that it stinks, but it's just what you have. That's the hand you're dealt, and working through that, and knowing, again, like, some tips or some information in here is valuable to know about, but not everything is going to work for
Yeah,
you.
for sure. For
One
sure.
thing that I did, I also liked when I was going back through my notes, was that he talks about doing creating your habits based more on less on outcome and more on like your identity. And so there he does
Mm,
talk a little bit more about reframing how you see yourself. And so I think that's just very useful in general if you're dealing with any kind of neurodivergence, especially if you've been getting a lot of negative messages and stories around it, is to kind of reframe your habits around the story. So, like, I am the type of person who cares about my health, instead of I want to lose weight or I want to eat more vegetables. And so so
mm-hmm.
kind of
For sure.
internalizing that and making it less more internally motivated than externally motivated.
Yeah. Yeah. As I was thinking about that, I kind of didn't love the whole like identity frame of that.
Hmm.
Like I'm the type of person, or like I'm a runner, or I'm a whatever, like
Right.
having to have this like identity label around it. I kind of prefer to think about it more, and I think he maybe did get to this eventually somewhere, but thinking of it in terms of more of like what are my values, like what are my personal values,
Right.
and like focusing more on that. And then how does this habit, or the steps involved in this habit, align with my values? And yeah, like kind of, I think you said like, am I a healthy person? But I also think of it in terms of like, okay, if being empathetic and compassionate is, a value of
Right.
mine, how does this habit align with that
Right.
or not? Right. And then that can kind of be a bit of a guiding light to direct you towards or away from some things too. And I feel like that, yes, is like more lasting than just like, did I remember to send that thank you card or not? It's more about
Right.
like, did I show this person that I care about them? Because showing people I care about them, and my relationships and connections to people is a value of mine.
Right. No, yeah, I get that. And it's, as you were talking about that, and you used as an example like empathy and compassion, um just going back to what we talked about earlier, was that um some of those habits, like if that is a value of yours, and I think that's a value of a lot of people, is, are you extending that to yourself? Like, if it's really a
Hmm.
value, it's not just for other people, it's, you're
Yeah.
deserving of that too. And
Yeah.
that's just something, that's not really related to habits, but it's just generally something I think it's just worth bringing up whenever, the
Yeah. Yeah.
compassion and care
100%.
for our own selves, that we extend to others.
Yeah. Well, and I think it is related because I think a lot of times the habits that we choose or like think we should do are a lot of times coming from, outside sources pressuring us to move in that direction too. And sometimes then the things that we're trying to do, the habits we're trying to build, sort of feel like they're for other people, maybe
Right.
more than they're even for us. But yeah, I think they're definitely for us too. And yeah, figuring out like where all of the different applications of that are. I think it kind of helps to redefine like what even the habit should be if we're basing it more off of the value rather than, the specific outcome.
Right. And you had raised this question earlier, was that how do we define habits if we
Mm,
often aren't going to get into that automatic
yeah.
process, because we just don't. Like I said, it's like the things that I do without think well, now I pick up my phone without thinking that is a negative habit, but like the general things that I do kind of without thinking that are routine things that I might like stack on. I mean, I've been doing my entire life, like teeth and contacts. I've been wearing them for 30 something years. So
Yeah.
that's just like what I do. But again, like I really have to be like, okay, am I going to wash my face tonight? Am I going to take off my eye makeup? Am I going to, like it's not automatic. And sometimes I go through phases where it is very automatic, but then it's not. And
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'll do something for a while. I'll meditate every day for like a month and a half, and then something will happen, and then maybe I'm only doing it, you know, a few times a week, or I just take a couple months off or whatever it is until I come back. Um, does that mean that like all of that effort, during the month and a half and then sporadically was, not worthwhile? I don't think so. I think it's still valuable, even if it wasn't done consistently. And I think he even mentioned something about that too, about how like, if you fall off, if there's like, a setback or you miss a day or something like that, like come back to it.
mm-hmm,
You can always come back. And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier too, that it's hard. Like when you
right.
have this like, oh, I have to keep this streak.
Mm-hmm,
I think that can actually demotivate, right? So I think it's more just like, okay, how can I, come back to this without having to beat myself up for missing it? And, I think I was just actually talking to a client about this not that long ago about some habits they were trying to build. And, I think it was a little bit like that. Oh, it's, I'm not doing it right because I'm not doing it every day. But they were doing it like maybe 2 days out of seven. Maybe it wasn't 5 or 7 days out of seven, but two is a lot more than zero. And
right.
so, sometimes just really noticing what is going well, you know, count the wins, right? And like celebrate those. And I think that was one thing too he was talking about, was focusing on like the process, and your systems,
Right.
over like the goals themselves. And I think that's maybe one way to kind of to do that, like be in like the process and like what are the systems that are in place and am I following through on those rather than so much focusing on like did I reach the thing, like
Right.
did I check all the boxes and get there to the final destination. And when you're focusing more on the systems and the process, then it's a little easier to celebrate the wins along the way. You don't have to wait till the end
Right.
to kind of get the satisfaction out of that.
Yeah, I think that's the same section where I feel like there wasn't it was kind of like, well, if you fall off, just yes, get back on. You can always start over again, but it was kind of like, but do it very quickly because otherwise, so there was that like, and exactly,
Yes.
there wasn't that like, how can you overcome that other than just with your willpower and your
Mm-hmm.
self-control?
For sure.
Because exactly what, when I realized tracking, because at first I thought like gamifying stuff by tracking it
Mm.
was
Yeah.
fun and cool. And then so I
Yeah.
was meditating and I had one of those apps and it told me how many days in a row I had meditated. And then I missed one day and my nice long streak was gone. And the next
Yeah.
day I was back at one and I just felt so
Yeah.
deflated that
Yes.
I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Oh, I've been there.
yeah, so I was like, so maybe and so this is kind of one of my mentors, Marcella Allison. She would always, whenever we were doing anything, she'd always be like, take what you like and leave the rest. Like some
Yeah.
things are going to work, not everything is going to work for everybody. So I think
Yeah.
that's definitely um some or that's definitely a lot of these books, especially when you start to realize that they are written. I mean, there's, I don't know, well, you might know the answer to this. When they're doing studies like this, are they screening for neurotypical people, or do they just take a general population and just because we make up less of it, our results are either the anomalies or the do you happen to
Yeah.
know any of that?
I mean, it would definitely depend on the methodology of the researchers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ideally, they would be screening for a whole bunch of different things and then kind of peeling off participants that would be confounding to
Right.
the results. But it's pretty hard to kind of, narrow something down so specifically that you get rid of like every possible
Right.
confounding
Exactly.
factor. So yeah, I mean, it would just depend on if like assessing for ADHD or neurodivergence was a part of the methodology when they were, selecting participants. And maybe some of them do, but I suspect a lot of them don't.
Well, probably not. And then, there's so many people who don't get diagnosed until later anyway. And a lot of these studies, I don't know, it
Yeah.
seems like a lot of them are done with college students. That's where a lot of
Yes.
research happens.
Yeah.
And so if you've never been diagnosed, you wouldn't even know. And it's not like you're going to go through
Right.
the several $1,000s of psychological screening just to be part
No.
of a study. So,
And the researchers wouldn't go that
right,
far either. Yeah.
right.
And on average. So, yeah.
So I think that's one of the most valuable things to take once you have a diagnosis is, or even if you don't, and you're just like, none of this is going to work for me. I know myself, and you're just feeling crappy about stuff. Maybe it's just
Mm-hmm.
take what you
Yeah.
like and leave the rest. Now, there was a
Yep.
section that I really liked towards the end where he talked more about like heredity and genes and, basically
Hmm.
about trying to work within your strengths, especially
Yes.
when you're trying to form, because some of these habits that we're talking about are like, I don't know, not everybody needs all of the same habits, or
No, of
wants to
course not.
cultivate them, but
Yeah,
where
yeah.
he talks about just really finding your strengths, and that your strengths don't have to be, they're not prescribed by anybody. And it even,
Mm.
when he gave the great example of Scott Adams, who did Dilbert, and
Mm,
and he
hmm.
was like, yeah, I'm a pretty good drawer, pretty funny, but there are people who are funnier, there are people who are better drawers, but I have the combination of both, plus I understand office culture. And so those three things, even though he wasn't the best at every single one of those things
Right.
combined, he's one of the
Yep.
top people who does all of those things together. And
Right.
so I think that is just really encouraging for people who feel like they've been struggling because they don't fit a particular mold. Sometimes you just got to make your own.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, like where do your talent, skills, strengths intersect? And yeah,
Mhm.
like maybe that's part of the key for you. I think when I first got diagnosed, I was probably a little too deep into the Reddits. But yeah, I think one of the things that I kept seeing a lot of people posting about was like, what are some good jobs or careers for people with ADHD? Like, I feel like that's just such a big question because it can be such a difficult question to answer for people with ADHD since so many workplaces or jobs have, a lot of obstacles for people with ADHD to overcome. And so yeah, like I think that's just a big question for a lot of folks is like what is my thing? Where do I fit? How can I take, you know, all of me and find a place where I can apply that?
Right.
I think that's a difficult thing for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, obviously my advocacy is just create your own thing and start doing it.
Right, yes.
But,
Yeah, which a lot
but
of us do, yeah.
yeah. But but yeah, at the same time, that's just not reasonable for a lot of people. And it is hard. Because I know ADHD is considered a disability, so you're allowed accommodations, but, um, I still think even with that, just some of the things that I've been reading is so hard to, um, get people to understand that it really is
Yeah,
it's something other than just like this fad diagnosis. And it really just means you're lazy. And
right. Yeah.
uh yeah, and because again, you can't, it's it's very hard to understand what's going on in someone's brain because our we take our experiences to be the normal. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I think even I've actually been wondering about that. I don't know how much of the diversity initiatives that are going through. I know there are a lot for different, bringing in more diverse people, but I tend to feel like that's more ethnicity or race or class or, people like
Mhm.
opportunities like that. I feel like it's a little bit less neurodiversity, or, it might even include like other more obvious differences, like accessibility for getting into the buildings and
Sure, yeah.
that stuff. But I feel like the neurodiverse piece is just harder, and I don't know that companies are focusing on that as much.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm not sure how I would know. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think I know what you mean. Like, is that even part of the conversation? Like, is that something that is being considered or um yeah,
Well, and then
included in the discussion? Yeah.
it kind of gets thorny too, because um if you are working and if me and someone else are working the same thing and I've got some accommodations, but there's no visible reason that I
Mm-hmm.
should have them,
Right.
but nobody can disclose why I have them because that's private information.
Right.
But then I could see how that just gets difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that it shouldn't be overcome, but I could see that it would be very complicated and
For sure. Yeah. Well, right. Like, how does that change the dynamics with your coworkers too? If they see you getting some kind of accommodation and they don't get it, like they
mhm,
don't see why you're getting like some kind of special treatment or something like that. Or, even if they, and I think that's where like the whole inconsistency thing can come in too, right? Like maybe they've witnessed you on like hyper focused, high capacity days where you're like getting it done
mhm,
and like on top of everything. And they're like, but like, why do you need help then? You
right,
can do this. Like I've
right.
seen you do it before. So like what's different now? I think
I
that
know, and
can
we
be
do that
hard
to
for people.
ourselves so much. Like
Yes, we do
I've
that
got,
to ourselves
yeah,
too. Yeah, for
so you're
sure.
like, I know, I have the same questions.
Yes, yeah, exactly. If I could answer that, or
Yeah,
do something about it, do you think I would? Like,
yeah. Did you
yeah.
think I enjoyed this? Um,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's totally kind of out of the scope of the book, but yeah, it was just
Yeah.
something that I was thinking about. And one of the lovely things about ADHD is the tangents,
Yeah,
and
exactly. Ah, so many tangents.
so many tangents. Um, did you have anything else particular that you remember about the book that you wanted to make sure we chatted about?
Um, I'm trying to think if there is something. I'm just gonna look through. Well, so one thing I did like about it was that he kind of broke it down into the habit loop and like the different components.
Mhm.
What was it? Cue, craving, I'm forgetting what the next one is.
Response.
Response and
We'll look through it.
I'll go back and find my note somewhere.
Cue, craving, response, and reward.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. So I felt like that was useful and to like think about how intervening at each of those steps could possibly, help you out, and the different ways that you can do that. Um, I
Yeah, I
also
do
re
like that, make it easy to do or make it hard if you're trying to stop doing something, just make it harder, like hard enough
right.
that you're not gonna.
Yes. Well, I found that the things that were like more add and make it like a positive
Mhm.
change rather than the negative of like make it harder or, I don't know. Some of those I feel like are a little bit more difficult, maybe just because, hmm, especially if it gets into punishment kinds of
Yeah.
stuff rather than, rewards and positive reinforcement. I feel like ADHDers have heard so many negative things. Like, it's like by age 10, people with ADHD have heard like 20,000 more criticisms
Oh
than
yeah,
their neurotypical
it's
peers or something like
mhm.
that. So, like, anytime we can eliminate something that's going to risk putting us into the shame spiral.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I put was the that accountability contract where if you
Oh,
I was like, that would
ugh,
just stress me out even more. But what I mean is more
totally.
like make like if I don't take my phone into the room or I
Mm,
even leave it far enough away that it is just not easily reachable. That's a thing that's just made it that much harder, where I'm like, okay, I'll do that later. Cause I'm
Yes.
not grabbing it because I really need to check something. I'm grabbing it out of habit. And so
It's there. Yeah.
right. So that like that kind of negative make it harder.
Yes.
But like if I had to like reset passwords every week or have someone else do that, I'd be like, yeah, that's
No.
it's not gonna happen.
Yeah, exactly. Things are already quite hard for
Right.
us. So yeah, I
Right.
think we need to be mindful about which things we make harder.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But
But what I wanted to say about like also having that like loop in mind is, I mean, it also means there's so many places for ADHDers to get distracted and like
right.
get off track in the loop. So just kind of, I don't know, figuring out what we need to do to get back on track when we get off, I think, is maybe something that needs to be, an addendum
Right.
for us that isn't in this book.
Right. And it might be that it's all, I mean, and again, because it's so different, everybody's experience with it is so different that um maybe you're always tripping up in the response area and I'm
Mm-hmm.
always tripping up in the queue area. Like everybody could have their own spot that's the particular,
Yeah.
or it could be inconsistent because, why not?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wild card today.
Yes.
Who knows what it's gonna be? But
Yes. Good day,
yeah.
bad day, everything in between.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And then the other thing that he did mention, and I think this is less habit and just more general, is the trap of being in motion versus action, and that
Yes. Yeah.
um, that preparation is necessary, but at some point, if it's just becoming this spiral to avoid the action, then it's not actually preparation. Now it's procrastination,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Mm-hmm.
is, I mean, I fall into that spiral all the time. I think
Oh,
that's
totally.
less habit based, but I think if you are trying to set up a habit or trying to work on a process or something, it would be easy, especially if you have a tendency for perfectionism to be like, well, the system isn't perfect. I can't try this habit until I've
Mm,
got like the whole
yes.
every,
Yes. And perfectionism is also something that often goes hand in hand with ADHD too. So yeah, that can definitely be tricky. I think I liked the study that he talked about with that, with the photography class, right? Like
yes,
where the group who just took more photos, even and were graded based on the quantity of the photos versus the group who were graded on one photo and the quality of that one
right,
photo. The group that took more photos actually ended up like performing better.
right.
So I thought that was useful too. Just like try stuff,
Hmm.
throw things at the wall, see what sticks, like instead of kind of getting stuck in that analysis paralysis that can come
Right,
up sometimes.
right.
Yeah.
That, but again, that comes down to the compassion. And yeah, there's so many
Yes.
things that we have to fight, like that compassion for ourselves. We're going to make mistakes, which means we're not perfect. So we have to be compassionate. And that means like it's, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot to deal with, to
Yeah.
try these things. And especially, I mean, habit formation is challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Especially if you're trying to change something. I don't even remember. I was a really, I chewed my nails as a
Mm.
kid. Like, I don't even know how I stopped. One day I just did, but I don't really know. It might have been when I became a parent and I was dealing with a lot of like unknown substances on my hands. Maybe that's
Oh,
what
fair
it
enough.
kind of
Yeah,
happened.
that
But
was a deterrent.
I don't chew them anymore, but I think it was more it is a bad habit, but I think that for me that was more, knowing what I know now, more stimming. And so then
Yeah.
that's the other thing, is like, is your habit um really a bad habit, or is it
Right.
something that
Yeah.
you're doing because it's calming, or and maybe it's negative, maybe you do want to change it, but you're going to have to replace it
Hmm.
with something else because
Yes.
you're
Yep.
going to need
That
that.
was something, yeah, I was thinking about too. When we talk about even like, okay, when we talk about like substance use with clients I work with or something like that, you're using it for a reason, like it's serving some kind of a purpose,
Hmm.
and just trying to eliminate it without having something else that's going to fulfill the need that habit was taken care of for
Hmm.
you, like you're probably just going to go back to it. So,
Right.
yeah, like some of it is what am I going to do instead,
Right.
to manage whatever was being managed by that habit that I'm trying to extinguish.
Especially if it's the cues are environmental. Like he gave that example of the woman
Yeah,
who, when she stopped, it was easier for her to stop smoking when she stopped riding horses because that's when she did it. And then like years later,
right.
but if your cues are the environment around you and you can't change it because I
Yeah,
mean, how much control do we all have? But I mean, maybe you can get another job, but or move to a new city. But what are you going to do?
sure.
Like,
Yeah,
so
some things are tough to change. Yeah.
right. So then you definitely need that that alternative that's going to meet that need because the cues are going to be all around you.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, sometimes even subtle things can change things a lot though too. Like whatever is within your control. I did like the parts where he's talking about the environment and
Mm-hmm.
how like sometimes we need to make those adjustments if we can, to yeah, the space that we're in, and how we kind of set things up to reduce the friction,
Right,
make
exactly.
it easier. I'm like all about that, right? If we notice it, right? Like if we're not so distracted and all over the place that it's hard to actually notice what is easier. But yeah, I think anytime we can do those kinds of things, and or even just put things in our space, in our visual space, so that we can be cued to remember to do them. I know like out of sight, out of mind can be a thing for me sometimes. So if I
Oh
can
yeah.
see it, more likely to actually remember that it was a thing that I
Right,
was thinking
exactly.
about doing. And yeah, just also keeping in mind that a lot of ADHDers have sensory issues. And so I don't think it's bad to try to make ourselves more comfortable and try to accommodate some of those sensory needs if it's going to facilitate us functioning in the way we want to function.
Right.
And in this case, building habits. Comfort is not always the enemy. I feel
Right.
like sometimes we need to think about, yeah, that in terms of the friction piece, right? Like, how do we reduce the obstacles to our focus and concentration and whatever? And sometimes I think changing the environment is a part of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things he just happened to mention a couple things that I like um well the the food journaling and but then also like tidying and like if you get in the
Hmm.
habit of putting things away but then everything is tidy and like I'm looking around at my desk and I like but if I try to make myself do that all the time it just becomes even more stressful and then I'm like I need a
Yes.
system for this and then I'm spending time on trying to get to a point where I'm like you know what I'm okay if my
Yep.
desk is messy. Like I can still
Hmm.
function here. When it bothers me enough, I clean it in an afternoon and
Right.
then it's fine for like months and months until it annoys me again. And so I don't, so I think there's some of that, like you said, like who are you trying to make this habit for? Because someone else
Yeah.
is like, you should have a tidy workspace. Or
Yep.
is it really because you can't work in an untidy space? So it would behoove you to create this habit.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I think getting into the whole like, who is this for? Why are we choosing the habits that we're choosing? What are the influences that are going into that? And we live in a society that puts a lot of pressure on us as ADHDers. We kind of already don't fit in. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes we can try uber hard to try to fit in, even into spaces where we don't need to. So I think it's important to kind of have that discernment. And one other thing that came up along with that is a lot of his examples had to do with like productivity and like, outputs, and how much money are you earning and how much weight are you losing, and, all of these things. And I just feel what about a habit of rest? A habit of taking time to recover and rejuvenate. And maybe some of our habits could be around not pushing ourselves so hard. and not burning ourselves out.
Yes. Not
So
optimizing every single thing.
everything. Yes, exactly. So I kind of wish there had been a little bit more focus on that. But maybe that's not the audience he was writing
Right.
to, but I was kind of looking for a little bit more of that.
Yeah, definitely. It did have that like corporate products, like even like the successful people and the winners, like
Yes.
it definitely did have that vibe of
Professionals and amateurs and whatever.
right. And
Yes,
yes,
all of
and
this. Yeah. Yeah.
so yes, there was definitely, and we all could use a little bit more of that reinforcement that it is important to rest, and it is important to not burn ourselves out. And
That our
yes, so,
identity doesn't have to be centered around like what we're doing and how
right,
much we're doing and what our, outputs are. That, who we are and our worth is not tied to just those things.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that I think is a great place to end this, because that is a wonderful message. So thank you so much for being here. Do you have are you on
Yeah.
social media? Do you, we'll put anything in the show notes where people
Yeah,
can find
sure.
you?
Yeah.
All right. But we'll just add those because nobody's
We
going to
can,
write them
yeah.
down. Nobody's
I
going to
know,
write them
right?
down while you're
Exactly. I know it. When I hear podcasts and people list that stuff out, I'm like, who's sitting in their car? Like, well, let me pull over so I can
yeah.
write this down.
Yeah. Although I also never go back to the show notes either.
I usually don't, but you never know.
But you always could.
You could, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, if anybody out there has thoughts about Atomic Habits or a book you'd like to hear us talk about, let me know. Erin will not always be the guest, although she is welcome back anytime. But this is kind of a rolling book club. Anybody can join. So if you want to leave any feedback, you can find me on my contact page at weirdlywiredwomen.com, even though I just said nobody writes this stuff down. It's in the show notes.
It just rolls off the tongue. Yes.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being here, Erin, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You too. Bye. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.